Hello and welcome to the Vaults of Terra. My name is Ed and today we're going to be continuing our Space Marines chapters videos with the Imperial Fists, one of the most recently requested chapter videos, and so let's get started, shall we? Now the Imperial Fists were one of the original 20 legions that fought during the Great Crusade. They were the Legion number 7, which I have confirmed due to my Roman numeral blindness in some of the other videos. Then their Primarch was Rorqual Dawn, and they are actually primarily a fleet-based chapter, and were so even in the times of the Great Crusade. One thing to note is that since that time they have had an intense rivalry with the Iron Warriors, who are now a traitor legion that live within the Eye of Terror. Now their current chapter master is Vladimir Pugh, and their armour is almost uniformly yellow with some black trim. Now their speciality is actually siege and urban warfare, and their battle cry is Primarch Progenitor, to your glory and to the glory of him on earth. Now to get started today, I just want to talk about the history of the Imperial Fists, because they actually have quite a long-standing history, which ties in greatly to the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. Now the Imperial Fists, like every other legion, were born on Terra, and were actually reunited with their Primarch early on, when actually almost 70% of the chapter were still aspirants or neophytes, and so the chapter actually developed with their Primarch, taking on his stoicism and his determination as they grew in number to the legion they eventually became. Now their doctrine was a little bit different from that of other Space Marine legions at the time. Now they very rarely took control of a world for themselves. They actually preferred to think of themselves as guests rather than regents. And on their recruitment worlds, such as the world of Necromunda, they actually followed the words of Dawn, which was they wanted recruits from the world, not vassals. Now this is quite different from the practices of Gulliman, who actually preferred to rule the planets they conquered rather than actually give them their own regency and just take recruits from that planet. Now during the Great Crusade, the Imperial Fists were more of a reservist force rather than an actual frontline troop, which not meaning they were any less fighters, but they were able to rapidly deploy to any front that required their services, because they were of course siege experts and have been since that time. And they were as good at defending a siege work as well as actually assaulting a siege work, and because of this they also picked up a speciality in urban warfare, becoming one of the best legions to actually call on when a hive planet or something similar required breaking. The Fists actually were not as harmonious with their other brother legionaries as, say, maybe the Blood Angels or the Lunar Wolves. In fact, the Iron Warriors and the Alpha Legion were both great rivals of the Imperial Fists, and obviously the Iron Warriors were also siege specialists, so you can understand why there was actually some rivalry. Now the Alpha Legion, actually, I think it was more along the lines of their battle doctrine, which was quite different from the Imperial Fists, which was stoically holding the line and doing everything to stand up to the enemy, whereas the Alpha Legion was more about infiltration, which is one of the possible reasons why they had that rivalry there. Nevertheless, it does mean that although Dawn was much revered by much of the Imperium, he was still far from the most amiable of Primarchs. Now, of course, I have to move on to the Horus Heresy, and I'm not going to go into great detail here. As I've always said, we're going to have our Horus Heresy videos coming up soon, so I don't really want to spoil it, adding in detail here. All I'm going to say is that during the later stages of the Great Crusade and the start of the Horus Heresy, the Imperial Fists and Dawn actually were located on Terra. What they were doing was reinforcing the Imperial Palace and the planet in general to resist any sort of siege. Now, of course, they started this before Horus had even fallen to chaos, so it was likely that the Emperor was actually reinforcing his palace in order to prevent any sort of blowback from him creating an Imperial webway on Earth. However, that work became vital after it became known that Horus did betray the Emperor. In fact, it was the Imperial Fists who picked up the ship from Istvan that carried word of Horus's betrayal to the rest of the Imperium. What they actually did then was split their fleet, sending a large element towards Istvan to join up with the other legions who were travelling there, such as the Salamanders and the Raven Guard, and the veteran companies and Dawn continued on to Terra in order to continue reinforcing the planet. Now, whilst the heresy was going on, Mars actually rebelled, which is something you can read about in the Horus Heresy books, still not sponsored by the Black Library, and what happened was that although the Imperial Fists were in the Sol system and so could intervene on the planet, unfortunately they were unable to prevent the rebellion from taking over, and so had to retreat from the planet, although they did manage to take away a large stockpile of ammunition and a large amount of the Mark IV suits of armour, the Imperial Maximus suit, which wasn't actually distributed to many legions at the time because Horus had actually redirected a lot of its distribution. Also, there was action for the Imperial Fists in the Fal system. Now, in the Fal system, the fleet that was actually trying to get to Istvan had to drop out of the warp in this system in order to get their bearings because they had become lost. Now, it was at this time they actually got up to date and heard about the Horus Heresy and heard about the drop site massacre, and so after having to deal with an Iron Warriors fleet that tried to intercept them, what they had to do was retreat in good order back into the warp and return to Terra. And the defence of Terra is something we all know about during the Siege of Terra, but just to clarify for anyone who doesn't know, there were 3 legions on the planet defending against the attacking forces of Horus, which were the Imperial Fists, the White Scars and the Blood Angels. Now, of course, Dawn had already reinforced the planet, and so it was a much tougher nut to crack than Horus believed, and so it took a lot of effort, more than predicted, and so they did actually manage to hold the Chaos Forces until they received word that other legions, such as the Ultramarines, Dark Angels, and Space Wolves, were on their way to reinforce Terra. Horus then, of course, dropped his shields on the Vengeful Spirit and allowed the Emperor, Dawn, and Sanguinius to teleport aboard. Now, Dawn's perspective in this was that he was too late to actually get to Horus before the Emperor and Sanguinius had already reached him, Sanguinius obviously being killed, and the Emperor being mortally wounded by Horus. Now, Dawn was struck by such grief at this time that it actually echoes back to some of his sons even today, because he was unable to defend his brother and his father whilst he was lost within the bowels of the Vengeful Spirit. Nevertheless, he personally took the Emperor himself, teleporting away from the ship back to the Imperial Palace, and under the Emperor's order interred the Emperor in the Golden Throne, where he is today. He also was one of the few who heard the last orders of the Emperor, and what had to happen next in order for the Imperium to survive. Now, after the Horus Heresy, Dawn was still stricken by grief at what he was unable to prevent, i.e. the death of Sanguinius and the mortal wounding of the Emperor, and so became vengefully charged, unlike the stoic defender that he was previously, going on a vast crusade throughout the galaxy to drive back the traitors and chaos that had infected the galaxy, pushing them back towards the Eye of Terror. Now, he had very little contact with the Imperium during this period other than to inform them of his progress, and didn't really take part in the reorganisation after the interment of the Emperor, until he heard about the Codex Astartes, when he was finally contacted by his brother Robert Gulliman and told to return to Terra. And the Codex Astartes was something that actually brought the two brothers to loggerheads at this point, because Dawn, along with Primarchs like Leman Russ, believed that the dismantling of the legions would go against the will of the Emperor and his orders previously, and was going against the Imperial spirit. Whereas Gulliman and some of his supporters believed that the will of the High Lords of Terra, who decided that the Codex Astartes was the right way to go, was actually the word of the Emperor, and so going against their ruling would be paramount to treachery. Now, this did lead to a vast amount of tension, and even an Imperial Navy ship firing on an Imperial Fists ship. However, after Dawn meditated for several days within the Pain Glove, one of the training devices on his flying fortress monastery, the Phalanx, he realised that in order for the Imperium to continue, the Codex would need to be ratified, and so dispelled the tension and decided to agree to taking up the principles of the Codex and splitting up his legion. Now, before this happened, he and his legion actually took the fight to the Iron Warriors at their eternal fortress, a 20-square-mile fortress of dubious design by Perturabo, the Primarch of the Iron Warriors. Now, this of course was a trap known as the Iron Cage, designed to destroy Dawn's forces and prove that the Iron Warriors were in fact his superior urban warfare and siege specialists. Of course, Dawn knew this, but he readily sprung a trap in order to try and defeat the Iron Warriors and prove the superiority of the Loyalists over the traitors. Now, it was nearly a massacre. The Iron Cage, which was what was inside the Eternal Fortress, was a labyrinth of tunnels, of defences, and pitfalls and traps, which almost led the Imperial Fists to complete destruction, meaning that they fought so hard that they actually had to end up using their combat knives because they ran out of ammunition for their bolters. However, despite this immense amount of suffering and pain that the Imperial Fists went through, and the losses and the lack of ammunition, they still managed to best the traitors, breaking through their final defences and proving that Dawn's loyalty was superior to Perturabo's traitorous ways, from the perspective of the Imperial Fists, of course. Now, the Imperial Fists compare this fight to Dawn going through his meditative state in the Pain Glove, showing that through pain and suffering, they could actually achieve a state of enlightenment as to their course of action. And so, where the Legion went in, the chapters of what used to be the Imperial Fists Legion emerged from the Iron Cage. Now, after the Iron Cage, the Imperial Fists officially recognised their descendant chapters. Basically, there was the Imperial Fist chapter, which continued with the same colours and continued with Dawn as his personal veterans, but there were other chapters which broke away from the Imperial Fists, based primarily on their temperaments, the Black Templars, of course, being the more fanatical and crusade-oriented brothers, whereas chapters like the Crimson Fists were the more level-headed and reserved brothers. Now, even after this breaking up of the Legion, the chapters remain close, and remain close to this day. Even after all this time, they still hold a ceremony known as the Feast of Blades, which is a centennial ceremony where a representative from each of the chapters is sent in order to display their martial skill, show the combat techniques of each chapter that came from Dawn, and actually to settle any rivalries that may exist, thus meaning that the chapters are all very amiable with one another. And finally today, just to cover off the rest of the history of the Imperial Fists, one of the more major campaigns they took part in was actually during the Age of Apostasy, where the Imperial Fists, along with the Black Templars, the Soul Drinkers, the Firehawks, and forces of the Adeptus Mechanicus, actually took the fight to Gorge Vandire in the Imperial Palace, beating back his loyalist forces and enabling the Reign of Blood to come to an end, allowing for the true loyalist forces to win out and allowing Gorge Vandire to actually be removed from his position as Ecclesiarch and High Lord of the Administratum, essentially the most powerful position that anyone in the Imperium other than the Emperor had ever held, showing of course their continued dedication and loyalty towards the Imperium, and the fact that they could assault the defences on Terra, showing their superior siege skills even today. Right, now that's everything I wanted to say in relation to the Imperial Fists. I hope you've enjoyed this video. We'll be continuing with the Imperial Fists next week with a bit more about their organisation, recruitment, homeworld and other such things. And if there's any other chapters that you want to hear about, such as the Legion of the Damned, who will definitely be getting a video after the Imperial Fists, then please let us know in the comments below and we'll see what we can do. So I hope you enjoyed watching today, and we'll see you next time on the Vaults of Terra.